the conservative cause and the Constitution. We remember his service to President Reagan in a number of capacities. We remember his campaigns for Senate. We know he gave it the college try against a fellow named Barack Obama in Illinois, drafted really at the last minute. Very good of him to accept that invitation and to carry on the good fight despite very long odds. Until 7:30, we have the opportunity to hear our keynote speaker, who will speak about the 9th Amendment and how we can use it to restore our unalienable rights. Ladies and gentlemen, Alan Keyes.
Good evening. I want to just get right into the discussion today, but I can't resist the need, the inner necessity to speak one word of praise. Because I was sitting and listening with all of you to Edmund Vieira this evening and reminded again of how wonderful it is to be in the presence of someone who has the same sense of integrity as he approaches the Constitution and the issues of our great republic as the people who founded it, and who therefore speaks with a sense of logic and right and respect for both the facts and the law, but more importantly, for the faculty of good reasoning that has come to us from God in order to help us understand what we need to understand if we are to sustain our liberty. And I have rarely had the opportunity, though I've often read your work and benefited from your wisdom and been encouraged by the way in which your wonderful, lucid clarity has seconded the motion of some things and encouraged the examination of other things that I have thought. And I just want to say, with a deep sense of gratitude, thank you, sir, for what you do. Because there are certain things that can't possibly be sustained if we Americans are going to lose sight of the need to apply not only our feelings and emotions and all these things that are appealed to these days, but our reason. That faculty of trying to understand things, not only, as they say these days, in terms of facts, but in terms of what facts cannot do, which is decide for themselves what is right and what is wrong, what is just and what is unjust. That understanding, that ability, especially in human affairs, to distinguish between what has happened and what ought to have happened, what will happen and what ought to happen. That is the ability that distinguishes our nature from the nature of beasts and stones. For at the end of the day, we know that we are responsible for something more than the event. We are responsible for the judgment of right and wrong that in our human existence has made that event possible. And one of the things that sometimes I think we forget as Americans is that when this nation began, it began in what I honestly and deeply believe to be a providential moment. Providential not because people were given some material wealth and gain and so forth. No, providential because by the grace and will of Almighty God, there came together a generation of people who were willing to open their hearts to His justice. And even in the midst of practices that they knew must in the end be condemned by the justice of God, yet they stood by His standard, even though the ones condemned would be themselves. And as they did so, there were those among them who also made choices that at the time were completely against their personal and class interests. The kind of things that these days they'll tell you, all the Marxists and the leftists will tell you it's impossible, nobody ever goes against their power interests and their class interests, their this interest, and that. And yet, the folks who founded the United States of America lived in a world where there was not only no reason for the elite few to share power with the many, but there was hundreds of years of history standing against any such acknowledgement of the justice of the participation of the people. And yet, Didn't I think by God and the truth of his scripture and the example of Jesus Christ, they refused this time to stand on their rights as Englishmen, as noblemen, as wealthy men and women. They stood instead on the right as endowed by God. Amen. And as in the end represented by the word, the right endowed by God, and in the end sourced in the word whereby he made all things that exist in creation. I start there because I think it's sometimes a good idea to remind folks of things that we certainly have forgotten. I was thinking about it and talking about it earlier today and at the table again this evening. We often review the words of the Declaration, and I'm going to be talking about some of those words this evening. But sometimes I think we fail to pause and to look at them in a serious depth in the context in which they were actually written. For instance, we have that famous phrase, all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Okay. I'm often told, by the way, that in many things that I do and say, I seem to be reflecting a Christian perspective, but Christ is never mentioned in the Declaration. And I just chuckle. And I say, well, the reason you think Christ was never mentioned in the Declaration is that you were not steeped in Scripture, right? As were the people who wrote the Declaration. For there it is at the beginning of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Through the Word, Him, all things were made. Okay? Without Him was nothing made. And later on, in John, we're told what? And that Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. What word is that? The Word through which all things were made, and without which not one of them was made. So, meaning no offense to the folks who don't bother to go back and look at the context, the Declaration certainly mentioned Jesus Christ. That's right. For it mentioned the Creator. And God in the activity of creation through which all things came to be in the world. That is the Word. And that Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us as Jesus Christ. I go through all of that because I think it's time, and I'm going to be talking about the rubric under which we necessarily must do it in our present situation. It's time for us to begin to face a fact that is no longer being faced in any sense at all, and I say this advisedly, by anyone I see who is party to what I believe to be now the partisan travesty that has replaced a just political process in our country. And I know it may offend some people, but there is no way that a reasonable person can any longer avoid the conclusion that we are not dealing with two parties opposed to one another, conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican. We are dealing with one faction, and that one faction is committed to the overthrow of government of, by, and for the people established in the Constitution. And the decision we have now to make is not the decision of which one of them shall be lifted up to be a figurehead for continual betrayal, a figurehead for continual treasons, a figurehead for the continual depredation of every liberty and every right and every decent institution on which this nation is founded. That is a choice that is no choice at all for real Americans. And we have better sense, I hope, than to continue to accept those terms. And we're not supposed to. Right. I was talking this evening, or earlier in the day too, to someone and made the point that I really don't understand what is happening right now to our people. Here we are, even on the conservative side, conservative they say, and so forth, and I don't even try to use the word Republican as if it means conservative anymore, because everybody must by now know how silly that is. Right? How absolutely contrary to all evidence and reason that So I will use the word conservative, but even there I sometimes marvel that you have folks who are supposed to be, and by conservative, I honestly believe a lot of folks mean conserving, which usually means to preserve and perpetuate, right? To conserve, make sure it stays around. That what we mean to conserve is the Constitution of the United States and the just form of government and way of life that has been its fruits. Yes? That's what we mean to conserve. That old notion where you go, you hear on the air all the time, where there's conservatives, they're for conserving the status quo. Hey, y'all, the status quo has become so depraved and so corrupt and so utterly devoid of any American principle that one would have to be insanely committed to evil to want to conserve this status quo. That we remembered, and I tried to remind people of it in a title I gave to one of my articles recently, in which I talked about the elitist faction effort to reverse the war for independence, to erase the effect of the American Revolution. So it was a revolution not only for our folks, it was a revolution in this historic understanding of what it was possible for just and decent government to be. For you read every philosopher, you read every thinker, you read every statesman and politician who had come before, they all would have told you that a government that was based on the premise that the people as a whole would participate in the great decisions that formed the destiny of their nation, that such a government was doomed to fail. And yet our founders decided that that would be the premise of our form of government. And yet they backed away from the silly notion that they could simply establish what we blithely call a democracy. And that's because the word democracy refers to the power or strength, material force of the people, kratos in Greek. And the founders knew better than to think you were going to form a just government on the basis of power. Because justice is not about power. Justice is about right.
Right, come on.
And right, by the way, is a word that I now must pause for again. Because we have so traduced the meaning of the term that we actually can listen to people while they conflate in a way that I think is logically impossible the word right and the word freedom. Freedom and right are not the same thing. Every right involves freedom, but every freedom definitely does not involve right. Indeed, the whole premise of the freedom that God has made possible for us, at least in our choices, is that He sets before us life and death and blessings and curses and justice and injustice and sin and virtue, and He says, choose. And He lets us choose. And He lets us bear the consequences of our choice, as they fall upon ourselves and upon our communities and upon our posterity. So we do remember, don't we, that if you have a choice between justice and injustice, and the Creator who made you lets you make that choice, then you can choose injustice. And lo and behold, many people have. Contrary to public opinion that seems to be prevalent in our movies, films, and politics these days, I frankly don't believe that most of the people chose injustice. I think most human beings, most of the time, have been disposed not to do wickedness to other human beings. But there are just enough amongst us who insist that they'll never do anything else. The kind of people who'll never tell the truth when a lie will do, who'll never buy it honestly if they can steal it by deceit. There are just enough of them that we all have to be on our guard all the time against that form of injustice. But the choice is there, between right and wrong, between justice and injustice. And if you go back and look at the words of the Declaration and what the founders said about their reason for it, they weren't fighting for freedom in the simple abstract sense of choosing to do whatever you want. As a matter of fact, most all the founders would have choked on the notion that they stood for such licentiousness. They would have rejected it utterly. And those who come amongst us now telling us they are libertarians because they believe that people can choose to do whatever they want and government must not interfere. I don't want anybody telling me what to do. That was Michael Savage the other day. Well, I'm sorry. That's not what the Declaration says. Matter of fact, the Declaration is premised on and pretty much begins with the acknowledgement of one simple fact. There is a government beyond all human power and government, and the United States of America is about a society that comes together, formed of people who are committed to do what? Well, we call it, in the Declaration, the consent of the governed. Have you ever asked yourself, governed by whom? See, we don't usually. We make assumptions. Oh, we naturally assume that somehow or another that consent of the governed phrase meant that governments are based on the consent of those they govern. No, because in the context of the Declaration, which was, by the way, a declaration of independence of a government, right? You're standing there, you haven't got a government, not a human government. You're rebelling against your human government. You're saying that the injustice of that human government requires that you stand against it because of what? Your own whim, your own rule, your own fabricated understanding of what you want to do today? No. They did it in the name of what they said were unalienable rights endowed by our Creator. What does that mean? The phrase unalienable is one of those alien phrases these days. It's a stranger. It's a word that I don't know, I bet most people, they hear it, they know it means something, but they're not quite sure what. Why is that in there? See? I wouldn't give my rights to aliens anyway. And I mean by that, people who come from outer space, not people who come from outside the boundaries of the country. But so they're pretty amused by it. But in that context, unalienable rights simply means that you are doing something that you have the lawful freedom to do, and that lawful freedom cannot be interfered with, thwarted, or otherwise impeded or taken away, because what you are doing is what? So much a part of your being as who you are, as who God has made you, that if that which you are doing is separated from you, your identity as that Creator made you will be undone. You will no longer be what you are supposed to be. Okay? Or to put it more simply, they are the things that allow us to maintain our status as human beings rather than submit to be treated as animals or stones. You understand what I'm saying? It's very simple then. An unalienable right is the permission, the permitted freedom to do something that it's impossible to deny without destroying your very nature as a human being. And what I find interesting and appalling is that we actually live in a time when, in a way, the issues that we confront are perfect illustrations of the meaning of that term. And yet they're never discussed in this way. We just had a decision by the Supreme Court of the United States in the Ehrbergfeld case, in which they purport to say that there's some right for homosexuals to marry, and they have to have equal rights with other people who are men and women who get married, and that is somehow sanctioned by our understanding of what is right and just. Is that true? No. Well, let's look at it in terms of that fundamental understanding in the Declaration. Endowed by their Creator, certain unalienable rights. So I look at it, and I'm not, let's not worry a moment. I'm not talking here about whether I approve or disapprove of homosexuality, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent activity, whether it's sinful and iniquitous and an abomination. I'm not talking about that right now. I will mention that. I'm not talking about it. I'm talking about another question that we have to ask positively. If somebody says this is the equivalent of an unalienable right, then it has to meet a certain basic criteria. You have to be able to show me where in our nature as human beings the activity you're talking about, the action that you're talking about, the choice that you're talking about is essential not only to the existence of a human individual, not only to the well-being and welfare of a human individual, but essential to the existence and perpetuation of human nature itself, without which that nature is being degraded, destroyed, and threatened with extinction. Can any of you think of an activity that is more identical with the requirement I just outlined than the responsibility for procreation? Because I can. I think it fits the bill perfectly. You are both taking care of individuals who come into the world all helpless without your aid. You are answering to your responsibility to the Creator who brings them into the world in that helpless condition, lays them before you for you to choose for or against the responsibility that He has entailed upon your act of procreation. And when you choose to accept that responsibility, you move forward to do what is right. Therefore, you have the right when you act, and no power on earth is free to interfere with that activity. For it is ordained by God. I don't see how to get any clearer. So the burden of proof was on the Supreme Court to prove that that kind of a right was involved in homosexual activity. And as Mr. Vieira said at several reprises during his talk, they didn't try to do that in the Supreme Court's opinion because they couldn't do it. It can't be done. Right? To pleasure yourself this way or that, making use of the conformation of the body for procreation, this may satisfy you a good deal. It may gratify you. It may even be some expression in your mind of goodwill towards some fellow human being as you think of it. But essential to the perpetuation of humanity, necessary to the very nature of man, the very assertion degrades the meaning of right, equates it with that which is pure human whimsy, taking it out of the grade of action that in fact rises above the power of human law because it responds and corresponds to the requirement of God's law, which supersedes all human will. Now what I just said, y'all, that was the simple, plain, clear logic of the Declaration. It's where the founders stood when they resisted the British tyranny. And what did they resist the British tyranny over? They resisted British tyranny over the fact that they were imposing taxes without the consent of the people, without being positive to their legislatures, without therefore meeting the requirements of just government. And by the way, if you go back and look at the circumstances, I've read several analyses that suggest that, contrary to what some people sometimes suggest, they didn't rebel against the taxes because they were onerous taxes that they couldn't afford to pay and all this. That's nonsense. A matter of fact, one case I read that was particularly well made, I thought, established the point that they actually cut the taxes in order to induce more consumption from the colonies. So if you were simply going after a materialist equation, the way people encourage us to do now, the founders would say, well, we're going to be spending much less money, our pocketbooks are going to be more full this way. Why are we worrying about these abstract rights? This is just a wise decision that has been made by the British administrators for our good. And they would have all gone home, drunk their tea, spent the extra money probably buying some coffee instead. No, they didn't do that, did they? They actually went to war, decided to spill blood. No. What if the British government had declared, as our Supreme Court recently did, that marrying, having children, raising them up in the way that they should go, and meeting therefore your responsibility for the procreation and perpetuation, not just of the human race, but of the human race according to God's understanding of its preservation and good, a benevolent understanding, was in fact equivalent to whatever it is that goes on between homosexuals for their own pleasure and gratification. what do you think the first generation of this country would have done? I believe they wouldn't have continued with their Tea Party and put their little dainty pinkies up to swallow some more of the swill. I think they would have gone to war much faster and with far less petitions and remonstrances than occurred in the decade before the War for Independence. What are we doing? Okay? This is not just an assault on some abstract notion. This is an assault on the very thing that represents the most concrete expression of unalienable right you could possibly imagine, and that therefore gives rise to something that is also, in some ways, so profound that we've forgotten about it. It gives rise to the form of government that is antecedent to all other human governments. The form of government that prevails when parents deal with their children, and when, for their good, as determined by God Almighty, they make decisions that are intended to preserve and protect and raise up those children so that they can live and take care of themselves and hopefully prosper in the world as God has made them and as He has made the world for them. See? And we've been told that somehow or another, that authority, which comes from God, which is part of what is involved in the unalienable right that's inherent in family life, that can now be overturned by the Supreme Court in a way that cuts off the connection between the institution of marriage and the acquittal of responsibility before God that gives rise to powers and authorities as well as freedom that cannot be subdued or otherwise interfered with justly by any human power whatsoever. This decision is a far more egregious attack on the unalienable rights that come to us from God than anything that occurred in the American Revolution. And yet, what have I heard? What have I heard from all these various and assorted quarters, including these people who said, I'm for Constitution, I'm for your rights, I'm for opposing the bad decision, I'm for traditional. I frankly never understood why we even accepted the notion that we were defending traditional marriage. No, tradition simply refers to what has been handed on from one generation of human beings to another. What's involved in marriage, what's involved in unalienable right, is not what is handed to us by our ancestors, but what was handed to them and to every generation of human beings by the hand of Almighty God. Amen. And in that sense, we do not defend tradition. We defend the purest understanding of right and justice, that which inheres in our relationship with the God whose benevolent will informed our existence in the first place, made us what we are. And in that sense, by the way, this is slightly aside, but that is where another relationship between right and freedom exists, but it's more philosophic and I don't usually go into it. To use it, not to dwell on it too much, but I'm always reminded when I think of it of the wonderful image of one of the famous sculptors, I forget, it may have been Michelangelo or one of them, who said that his job, the sculpture was in there, and his job was to free it from the stone. See? His job was to free it, it was already there. And what he had to do was cut away everything that wasn't the sculptor, so that it would emerge as what it is, yes? And in that sense, he actually frees the sculpture, right? But he frees it by recognizing the boundaries and limits of its form, by cutting away at the stone in perfect respect for those boundaries and limits, so that the form that the statue is to take will appear, will be freed from the backdrop of the substance, marble, whatever, that imprisons it, that veils it from our sight. And that is, whether we like to think about it or not, exactly why there are bounds and limits to our nature. Why when we think of God and what He has done for us, we must also think in terms of His rules and His laws, the bounds that He has set and the boundaries He has made to our existence. Those boundaries exist so that we can be set free. Set free from the background of material substances that have no choice, that have no self-consciousness, that are therefore not capable of loving and respecting and choosing in favor of God. Not standing as He meant us to stand, one rung below that level which even the angels must envy. For it is the level at which God Himself chose to stand, taking on our form and our limitations, even as He sought to redeem our mistaken error about the nature of our liberty. Well, what sense does it make to stand for the freedom to do that which destroys the work that is needed to set you free? Is that freedom after all? That idea of freedom makes no sense at all. And the founders rejected it. They rejected it emphatically in the Declaration. They rejected it emphatically in the course of that long and arduous struggle with the British. It wasn't a snap of the fingers war, you know. It was a war that claimed lives and property, and it claimed children, and it claimed wives, and it claimed all the goods that they had laid up. Many of them successfully in their adventure in the New World. They did not only risk it, they paid for some an awesome price. And that being the case, how can we pretend to read the words that they wrote and not take account of the serious discipline that they accepted for the sake of those words? The notion that somehow what they fought for was absolute licentious freedom is an insult to God and the founding. And I reject it. But what they did tell us was that they fought for right. They fought for right according to whom? According to God. And as He has communicated it to us in the very nature of our being. Now there might have been an excuse for people to quibble about what I just said a long time ago about whether that was nature and what it involved. But I don't see how we get there anymore. We understand things now in a way that actually makes sense of the Bible and the words of the Declaration from our human point of view more than ever before. People used to have to read that whole passage about the Word and think that referring to some abstraction or some magic syllable God spoke and so forth and so on. But we don't have to think that way anymore, as I point out to people all the time now, because I keep reading these things that the more we learn, for instance, about the human body, the more it appears to be nothing but a very complicated information processing unit. And it turns out that with the right kind of matter at work in that information processing unit, you end up producing the things of this world. Isn't that interesting? That's literally the Word being the thing through which all things are made. And we're scratching the surface, trying to pretend that suddenly we know everything. No, we don't. We're just getting to the bare little outline of what was already told us in the Scripture. We just weren't able to understand it yet. And now that we come to the point where we can understand it better, we're trying to pretend that somehow or another that word does not indicate the presence and activity of a benevolent, authoritative intelligence that operating for our good has laid before us information built into our very bones, as it were, that disposes us to do what is right, to eat the food and drink the water and be attracted to one another in the way that will perpetuate the human species as He intended it to exist. That's what's going on. Now, it's clear that the purpose of government, according to the Declaration, is to secure us as we implement, deploy the freedom that's involved in our execution or implementation, or exercise as we call it, of right. In all the different areas where we are being instructed by God to do that which is for our good, we are in fact exercising right. Yes?
Yeah.
And that's the meaning of rights that actually brings it right home, makes it very clear and practical too, by the way. We're not talking about abstractions here. We're talking about the things that we must do in order to do more than survive. For God did not intend us for mere survival. He intended us like the stars and like the mountains and like the glorious universe itself. He intended us to portray His glory. So we are more than expected to survive. We are expected to glow with the power and the love and the benevolent intention of God. Well, Alan, that's all well and good, and right, you may be right. That's in the Declaration. How many times, however, have I heard people tell me, that's in the Declaration, but what's that got to do with the Constitution? The Constitution makes no mention of God. Now, there are two possibilities here. That they're wrong about what's in the Constitution, I'll get to that one. Or that they're right. Because in an explicit sense, the Constitution does not talk about God. Makes no mention in the Constitution of the Creator. Some of the lawyers try to pretend, and I explored this during the controversy over Obama's birth certificate and the meaning of the words natural-born citizen. And I often explain to people that I knew that I was not so much struck with the phrase itself, though you can argue about what natural-born means. I was struck by the fact that it refuted one of the positions that is now taken almost universally by legal professionals in the United States, which is that the Constitution of the United States is not a natural law document. They always tell you that. It's not a natural law document. Got nothing to do with the natural law. No mention of the natural law in the Constitution. Well, if there's no mention of natural law in the Constitution, someone explain to me how you can make sense of the phrase natural-born citizen without it. Since I think the phrase natural-born means born according to nature, born by nature, born in the way that nature prescribes. See? And last time I looked, in nature, things are prescribed and operate by the laws of nature. See? And the laws of nature, as the founders acknowledged, ultimately come from the Creator, God. So, in the first instance, it looks like the natural law is mentioned in the Constitution. And it's not only mentioned in the Constitution, it's mentioned in a very, very key spot. Because the founders had read Montesquieu, and they understood that in the literal sense, the power of government is invested completely in every executive action. There is no distinction between judicial, legislative, and executive power at the moment of acting. Those three faculties must come together in order for you to have a lawful action. Right? And so, if you're talking about the executive, every time the executive moves, there's a presumption that all those three powers have been consolidated into one moment. Action is required, a judgment is made that this is the criminal, and that I know the law that this criminal has violated and therefore must move against that person. The executive is required, therefore, to, in that moment, employ what? What Edmund today reminded us is, in essence, tyrannical power. And the only thing that keeps it from being tyrannical is if none of those things that are brought together in that moment have ultimately been decided by the same power, person, individual, group. And that's what the division of power was about. To keep every executive action from being a tyrannical act. See? Quite fascinating. Well, this is something that I think was clear in the minds of the founders, seems to have been forgotten now, but was remembered in every respect when they were putting the Constitution together. See, so when they put that word nature and said, you can't put somebody in this executive position if they're not natural born, they were invoking a standard of natural law so that the key and most important direct avenue to tyranny could not be held by anyone who was not a citizen by nature of the United States. See? Now, I won't go into all of this because I don't have time. But there's another meaning to the word by nature that needs to be considered. Because when we see somebody who's really good at a sport they've never been taught, my wife, it turned out, we went on a trip to Montana, I think it was, and someone took us to visit a shooting range. My wife had never shot a weapon in her life of any kind. And they had one of these targets way off, where you hand somebody the rifle, and if they hit it, you'll hear a bell ring, right? And if I hands this rifle to my wife, who has never even held a weapon in her life, shows her how to do it, and the next sound you hear is ping, ping, ping. Whoa! I guess I got a natural marksman. So we understand at that point that some people just, it seems to be in their bones to do certain things. They seem to have, the green thumb or the disposition to the instrument. They just know what it's about. See? Well, the interesting thing about the United States, it's one of those things that makes me worry of people like Donald Trump, is that they seem to forget that there is such a thing as an American by nature. Mm-hmm. Because our nature as a people is not defined by the common language we speak, though that's important to our practical national existence. No, it's not. It's not defined by the fact that for generations and generations we can count the place of our ancestors and the graves of our ancestors within the boundary of this land that has been our own. No, most of us who scratch us a couple of generations back and we were counting some other place where the bones of our ancestors rest and so forth and so on. No, that's not what defines us as a people. The nature that defines us as a people is the nature of humanity itself. The nature that was intended by God when first he said, "Let us make man in our image and likeness." The nature that he had in mind when he set down the boundaries and the norms that would define our human capacities and our human limitations so that we could be set free. The nature that does indeed define us as a people, but also makes it possible for us to come together in a room that brings together all the continents and practically all the nations of the earth, so that we can sit together as Americans, knowing that by doing so successfully, we advance the cause of humanity itself. That's the nature that is evoked in our Declaration and in our Constitution, for it is the nature of human beings, as was in the mind of God when first he said, "Let us make man." So it looks like the Constitution is a natural law document, or at least must be understood as that at one critical point. And as often happens with these things, and this is into my final set of points, as often happens, that little phrase, natural born citizen, they kind of avoid talking about it in the courts. And I think that's one of the main reasons they didn't want to take on the objection to Obama's claim of citizenship. Because it would have involved making a natural law argument, and they refuse. They don't want to face the truth. They want to keep that little tidbit of information as far off the radar screen of the American people as they can, because they're in the business of overthrowing our form of government. So, but I've got to tell you, the final set of points I want to make tonight, they don't get away with it, because there is in the Constitution another clear vindication of the understanding that the Constitution involves unalienable rights endowed by God. And it's not, by the way, where you'd think, oh, you're talking about the First Amendment, Second Amendment, this amendment, that amendment. No. It is in the Bill of Rights, though. But it's not a right contained in the Bill of Rights. It is rather a statement about how the Constitution is to be construed. Mm-hmm. And it says that the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Whoa. The first question you ought to ask yourself is it possible to retain something you don't already have? No. No! So when that language was written, saying that nothing in the Constitution is to be construed, etc. The rights retained were being retained by the people who had obtained those rights before the Constitution existed. That's clear. Otherwise the word retained would be meaningless. That means it's not granted by the Constitution. If you hear anybody, and I hear it from many people, where do our rights come from? The Bill of Rights. No. As I often tried to say to people, if our rights come from the Bill of Rights, what did those poor fools do when they were writing the thing in the first place? How on earth did you write the Bill of Rights when you need the Bill of Rights to know what rights to put in there? No, that doesn't make any sense. So they must have been there, and they must have a source somewhere else. Now, some people will argue, I think not entirely incorrectly, that retained by the people could refer out to common law understanding of certain things that were rights that people had under the common law. And I'm sure that it partly meant that. Okay? Because that would have been acknowledged as a premise that the states were not going to be stripping people of those things. Some of it involving marriages, parental rights, inheritances, property, that were decided according to the common law. You're not going to lose all of that in America. But that would still require the human governments and so forth. But what about people who didn't come from them, didn't have any such rights and so forth and so on? They're not referred to in the, because it says retained by the people as a whole. What rights would be retained by the people as a whole? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. Since all the people, last time I looked, were human beings. Well, some of them denied their human rights and human thises and that's, but still human beings. And they were acknowledged, by the way, all of them, including the slaves, as persons. Mm-hmm. See, so they're part of the people of the United States. Why did you say that, Alan? I say that because the Constitution at various reprises, it knows the difference between citizens and persons because it uses different words at different times, even in the Bill of Rights. And certain of the things that are talked about in the Bill of Rights say no person shall be deprived. See? They're referring, therefore, to anyone who is a person. But the most important indication to me that black folks and all these people, some people sometimes try to pretend, well, they're not persons, they're the very clause they cite, the 3/5 clause, when you read it, instead of just accepting a lot of propaganda about it, it clearly states that black people are persons. It doesn't say that black people are 3/5 persons. No, it says 3/5 of all other persons. Therefore, the people they're referring to are persons. You don't count all those persons for the purposes of dividing up the representation in the Congress, but they are all persons. You see what I'm saying? So all the people are included in that reference to the people in the Ninth Amendment. And what does it say? That the rights that it shall not be construed, the Constitution shall not be construed in any way that allows the enumeration of rights to become the excuse for denying or disparaging. Denying or disparaging, that's very interesting. The denial we sort of can easily understand, right? Why disparage? Go to the dictionary, look up disparage. Disparage basically means to speak badly of, to denigrate in some way, to lower the status of, right? And by the way, it is a legal term. You actually, it has a formal legal meaning. And so if you disparage the rights, you are demoting them, you are depriving them somehow of substance that they ought to have, and lowering them. Tell me, if you are the beneficiary of an understanding that acknowledges that you are exercising an unalienable right, we do notice, don't we, in America, that unalienable rights trump laws. Mm-hmm. If a law is passed in this country and you can demonstrate that it involves a necessary denial of unalienable right, the unalienable right wins out over the law. Because the unalienable right comes from a higher sovereign. And our understanding of the law has been, that's why the Supreme Court can sometimes make decisions in cases where they evoke some doctrine of rights and say, oh no, they have the right, this law violates that right, Therefore, I can't impose that part of the law because it's not constitutional to go against people's basic rights. Yes?
Yeah.
But then they try to pretend that the only rights that have that privilege are those enumerated, but the Ninth Amendment says that's not true. It says we retain others. What are those others? Well, I don't know. They could be common law, they could be this called Dutch law, I don't know what, but I do know this, that in the founding generation there was no doubt that they included those unalienable rights that come from Almighty God. And what could be more fundamental to the very existence of and perpetuation of human nature than the rights of the natural family, the authority inherent in the family, as well as the responsibility and actions that must be undertaken by the family by the command of God. And yet they want to equate that with a relationship that in no way relates to that status of unalienable right. They want to equate an unalienable right with a right fabricated not even by a legislature, but by the whims of justices who don't even have the power of legislation. Will somebody tell me where they're getting this from and why we are patiently listening to others who tell us they've said it, it's the supreme law of the land? Well, I don't care who says it. I don't care if Cruz says it and Trump says it and Carson says it. I reject them all because it can't possibly be true. So I say that if we really mean to maintain our form of government and way of life, then I think we need to start objecting, not just with words, but in deeds, to these activities that have now, and I thought one of the brilliant things about Mr. Vieira's presentation today was that he's showing us how long this has been going on. That it's being built into the very fabric. And what am I talking about? The effort by an elitist faction, a faction of people who think we're the ones, we've got the power, we've got the money, we've got the media, we've got the wisdom and the expertise, and therefore this whole form of government was a mad experiment that opens the gates to human depravity. And I'm thinking to myself, you guys look like the ones who are opening the gates to human depravity. It seems to me that this people, you are denying their rights and disparaging their liberty. This people is the one who's trying to stand in your way, trying to stand for decency, trying to stand for constraint, trying to stand for the discipline that meets the responsibilities of our humanity. And that this elitist class is trying to rip all of those things away. I think it's time that we made it our purpose to go back to the Declaration, to go back to the Constitution, to understand not only what they say, but how they relate to one another. And finally, and most importantly of all, how they relate to the simple truth that is stated in the Declaration. For at the end of the day, because our rights depend upon it, our way of life does not depend upon freedom, unalienable rights, or even the Constitution. All of those things ultimately have no ground on which to stand, except we acknowledge, as the founders did, the authority of the Creator, the Almighty God, who is the supreme judge of the world, and to whose providence they trusted the fate of their revolution, even as we must now entrust the fate of our effort, come what may, to make sure that we are not deprived of its fruits. God bless you.
Folks, the original program was supposed to come to an end about 5 minutes ago. However, we do have an Ask the Speakers Q&A planned. Would you like to stay for another 10 or 15 minutes and be able to ask Dr. Vieira, Dr. Jaley, and Dr. Keys questions about what they had to say tonight? While we're giving them an opportunity to get themselves set up, I've been asked to have Diane Bitter from the 603 Alliance come up for a very brief chat about her organization and why they're here.
I'll be very brief, everyone. Thank you for allowing me to speak to you tonight. I represent the 603 Alliance. For those of you who have not heard about this organization, this is a new organization whose mission is to make sure that we restore all levels of government to the constitutional principles that this country was founded on. One of our major projects is to hold a caucus, first ever in the state of New Hampshire, October 17th in Hopkinton, at the Hopkinton Fairgrounds. Please go to our website, www.603alliance.org. Get all the information there. Thank you.